At the turn of the 20th century, America was no longer defined by land or inheritance, but by industry, speed, and materials that could keep up with a nation in motion. Cities expanded faster than tradition could follow, and wealth no longer flowed from old titles, but from factories, machines, and raw resources that modern life could not function without. In this new industrial order, Akron, Ohio emerged not by design, but by necessity. Positioned near rail lines, waterways, and an abundant labor force, the city became the unlikely center of a material that would quietly reshape the country: rubber. As automobiles transformed from curiosities into necessities, rubber became indispensable, binding roads to wheels, factories to transportation, and cities to the future. This was an economy built on demand that never slept, where fortunes were made not through spectacle, but through supply chains, contracts, and relentless production. It was here, in a city driven by smoke, labor, and opportunity, that a new class of industrial leaders rose, men who did not inherit power, but manufactured it. They built companies before they built legacies, and amassed wealth faster than society could decide what to do with it. Yet money alone was not enough. In an era still haunted by the prestige of old Europe and inherited authority, industrial wealth needed symbols, structures that could translate financial dominance into permanence. Mansions became more than residences. They were statements of arrival, attempts to anchor new power within the illusion of timelessness. Hywet Hall was born from this exact moment in American history, not as a relic of aristocracy, but as a deliberate response to it. It stood at the intersection of ambition and insecurity, industry and tradition, representing a dynasty that believed it could convert industrial success into lasting authority. Before the walls were raised, before the halls were named, the conditions had already been set. A city hungry for rubber, an economy racing forward, and a man determined to prove that modern power could stand beside history itself. Chapter 1. The Man Before the Empire. Before the factories, before the boardrooms, and long before Hywet Hall stood as a symbol of industrial confidence, Frank A. Seiberling was simply a man shaped by uncertainty, ambition, and a rapidly changing America. He was born in 1859 into a family that understood business but did not possess dynasty. His father operated a modest manufacturing enterprise, offering young Seiberling early exposure to the rhythms of production, risk, and responsibility. This was not inherited power in the European sense, nor was it old money rooted in land or lineage. It was practical knowledge, earned, fragile, and always at risk of collapse. From an early age, Seiberling learned a defining lesson of industrial America. Security was temporary, and survival depended on adaptation. As a young man, Seiberling did not display the traits of aristocracy. He was not groomed for social dominance, nor surrounded by generational wealth that insulated him from failure. Instead, he entered adulthood during a period when American industry rewarded decisiveness more than pedigree. The late 19th century was an unforgiving environment for entrepreneurs. Markets expanded rapidly, but so did competition. Technology moved faster than tradition, and entire industries could rise or vanish within a decade. Seiberling's early business efforts reflected this instability. He experienced financial setbacks that would later shape his worldview, failures that taught him the cost of hesitation and the value of control. One of the most consequential moments of his early life came not through success, but through loss. When his family's business collapsed due to debt and foreclosure, Seiberling did not merely lose capital, he lost status, security, and the illusion that effort alone guaranteed survival. For many, such a fall would have marked an ending. For Seiberling, it became a recalibration. The experience hardened his understanding of power. Wealth, he learned, was meaningless without control, and control was impossible without scale. small operations were vulnerable. True authority belonged to those who dominated entire systems. This realization coincided with a pivotal shift in American life. The nation was moving, literally. Railroads crisscrossed the country, cities expanded outward, and automobiles began their transformation from novelty to necessity. Mobility was no longer a luxury. It was becoming infrastructure. Seiberling recognized what many still overlooked. The future of transportation would not be defined solely by engines or steel, but by the materials that allowed motion to exist at all. Rubber, still an imperfect and volatile material at the time, was emerging as one of the most critical components of this new world. Seiberling was not an inventor in the romantic sense. He did not revolutionize rubber chemistry on his own, nor did he rely on visionary genius. His strength lay elsewhere, in coordination, organization, and timing. He understood how to assemble talent, capital, and opportunity into something larger than the sum of its parts. When he helped establish what would become the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, it was not an act of idealism. It was a calculated move grounded in lessons learned from failure. He pursued volume, contracts, and institutional relevance rather than prestige. Yet even as his influence grew, Seiberling remained acutely aware of what he lacked. He had wealth, but not heritage. He commanded industry, but not tradition. In a society still influenced by European notions of class and permanence, industrial leaders like Seiberling occupied an ambiguous position. They were powerful, but new, respected, but not rooted. This tension would quietly shape his decisions long before any mansion was conceived. The desire to stabilize power, to make success appear inevitable rather than circumstantial, became central to his thinking. Frank A. Seiberling's identity before the empire was defined by contrast. He stood between eras, too modern to belong to old aristocracy, yet too ambitious to remain merely industrial. He was shaped by loss, disciplined by competition, and driven by an understanding that survival required more than profit. It required legitimacy. This internal conflict between what he had built and what he had not inherited would later manifest in architecture, ritual, and legacy. But at this stage, there was no mansion, no dynasty, and no illusion of permanence. There was only a man who understood that power, once gained, had to be defended not just economically, but symbolically. And the foundations of that belief were laid long before the first stone of Hywet Hall was ever placed. Chapter 2. Akron becomes the rubber capital. By the dawn of the 20th century, Akron, Ohio, was no longer an ordinary Midwestern town. It had become a city defined by motion, noise, and demand, an industrial organism reshaped by forces far larger than its geography. What transformed Akron was not ambition alone, but convergence. Rail lines cut through the city like arteries, canals linked it to regional markets, and a steady influx of labor arrived from rural America and overseas. These conditions did not create wealth by themselves, but they made Akron receptive to an industry that the modern world was beginning to depend on: rubber. Rubber's rise was inseparable from the rise of the automobile. As cars shifted from experimental machines to mass-produced necessities, the nation faced a new problem. Movement required durability. Roads could be built, engines refined, and steel perfected, but without tires that could endure distance and speed, the promise of mobility collapsed. Rubber became the silent enabler of modern life, and Akron became the place where that need could be met at scale. Factories multiplied, smokestacks replaced church spires on the skyline, and production schedules began to dictate the rhythm of the city itself. Unlike older centers of wealth, Akron did not grow around finance, shipping, or inherited land. Its prosperity was mechanical and relentless. Rubber factories demanded round-the-clock labor, precision, and volume. Entire neighborhoods were constructed to house workers whose lives revolved around shifts, quotas, and production targets. Wages were steady, but discipline was strict. The city expanded not through elegance, but through necessity. Akron's identity became inseparable from its output. To work in rubber was to participate in the future, even if the cost was exhaustion, injury, or disposability. As rubber companies consolidated power, they also consolidated influence. Industrial leaders dictated not only employment, but urban planning, housing, and civic priorities. The city adapted to their needs. Roads led to factories, rail lines served warehouses, and municipal decisions aligned with industrial expansion. Akron did not merely host the rubber industry, it reorganized itself around it. In this environment, economic success translated directly into social authority. Those who controlled production controlled stability, and stability was the most valuable currency in an era of rapid change. Yet this dominance carried contradictions. Rubber wealth was immense, but it lacked the cultural legitimacy of older fortunes. Unlike East Coast banking families or European aristocracies, Akron's industrial leaders were new, visible, and inseparable from labor unrest and environmental cost. Their power was undeniable, but it was rooted in factories rather than tradition. This created a distinct tension within the city. On one side stood the workforce, essential yet replaceable. On the other stood executives whose decisions shaped thousands of lives, yet whose status remained precarious in the broader social hierarchy of America. Akron's transformation into the rubber capital of the world was therefore not just an economic shift, but a psychological one. The city embodied the promise and the anxiety of industrial capitalism. Prosperity arrived quickly, but permanence remained uncertain. Markets fluctuated, technologies evolved, and competition intensified. Every factory expansion carried the implicit threat of contraction. Success demanded constant growth, and growth demanded unyielding control. In such a climate, power was never assumed to be secure. It had to be reinforced, financially, socially, and symbolically. For the men who led Akron's rubber empires, the city offered both opportunity and exposure. Their wealth was visible in payrolls, production figures, and market share, but visibility also invited scrutiny. Labor strikes, public criticism, and economic downturns reminded them that industrial authority was conditional. Unlike inherited dynasties, their influence could be challenged by market forces or collective resistance. Akron rewarded efficiency, not lineage, and efficiency alone could not guarantee legacy. It was within this environment that the foundations of dynasty thinking emerged. The leaders of Akron's rubber industry began to recognize that industrial power, while vast, was inherently temporary unless translated into something more enduring. Factories could close, companies could merge or fail, but symbols, physical, cultural, architectural, could outlast balance sheets. The city itself demonstrated this truth. Its growth was written not only in profits, but in streets, neighborhoods, and institutions shaped by industrial priorities. Akron became a proving ground for a new kind of American authority. It showed how quickly wealth could be created when industry aligned with national demand. It also revealed how fragile that wealth could be without tradition to stabilize it. The rubber capital was both a triumph and a warning. It offered unprecedented control over production and labor, while simultaneously exposing the limits of economic power alone. For those at the top, the question was no longer how to build an empire, but how to make it endure. By the time Akron fully claimed its title as the rubber capital of the world, the city had already set the conditions for a deeper transformation. Industrial success demanded representation. Authority sought permanence. And the men who had reshaped the city through rubber began to look beyond factories and ledgers towards structures that could convert industrial dominance into historical presence. Akron had become the engine. What remained was to define the monument. Chapter 3. Building Goodyear. Building Goodyear was not an act of sudden brilliance, nor the result of a single invention. It was a process shaped by necessity, pressure, and a precise understanding of how modern industry rewarded scale over sentiment. When Frank A. Seiberling helped establish what would become the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in 1898, the company entered a market that was promising but unstable. Rubber manufacturing at the time was technically difficult, financially risky, and highly competitive. Many firms failed not because demand was lacking, but because consistency and volume were difficult to maintain. Goodyear's early years were defined by this uncertainty, operating in a world where innovation alone was insufficient without organizational discipline. From the beginning, Goodyear distinguished itself not through luxury branding, but through its commitment to mass production. Seiberling understood that the future of rubber lay not in bespoke craftsmanship, but in standardized output capable of serving an expanding national market. Automobiles were still far from universal, but their trajectory was clear. As roads expanded and vehicle ownership increased, tire demand would follow. Goodyear positioned itself to meet that demand before it fully materialized, investing in capacity rather than waiting for certainty. This decision carried risk, but it also established the company's defining advantage: readiness. The company's growth depended on coordination rather than charisma. Seiberling focused on assembling technical expertise, securing reliable sources of raw rubber, and maintaining close relationships with manufacturers who depended on tires for their own success. Goodyear did not simply sell products, it embedded itself within a broader industrial ecosystem. Contracts, partnerships, and logistics became as important as engineering. Each tire represented not just a commodity, but a link in a chain connecting factories, transportation networks, and consumers. Control of that chain became central to Goodyear's strategy. Labor played a critical role in this expansion. Goodyear's factories demanded disciplined, repetitive work performed at increasing speed. Akron's workforce, composed largely of migrants seeking stability, provided the manpower necessary to sustain growth. Employment offered wages and continuity, but it also imposed regimentation. Shifts were long, expectations rigid, and tolerance for disruption minimal. The company's success relied on maintaining order within an environment prone to fatigue and unrest. Management structures were designed to minimize unpredictability, reinforcing the principle that efficiency outweighed individual circumstance. As Goodyear expanded, its influence extended beyond factory walls. The company shaped Akron's physical and social landscape, determining where people lived, how they worked, and what rhythms defined daily life. Production schedules dictated traffic patterns. Payroll cycles influenced commerce. The city's prosperity became increasingly tied to Goodyear's performance, blurring the line between corporate success and civic stability. In this arrangement, economic authority translated directly into social power. Decisions made in boardrooms reverberated across neighborhoods. Yet despite its growing dominance, Goodyear operated within a volatile market. Competition intensified as other rubber companies recognized the same opportunities. Technological improvements reduced barriers to entry, and pricing pressures remained constant. To survive, Goodyear had to grow continuously, reinforcing a cycle in which expansion became both strategy and necessity. Stagnation was interpreted as vulnerability. Growth was not optional. It was defensive. This reality shaped Seiberling's leadership style, emphasizing consolidation, foresight, and the relentless pursuit of scale. Building Goodyear also required navigating the tension between innovation and control. While experimentation drove improvements in durability and performance, standardization ensured profitability. The company balanced research with repeatability, ensuring that new developments could be integrated into existing production systems without disruption. This balance reinforced Goodyear's reputation as reliable rather than revolutionary. Reliability in an industrial economy translated into trust, and trust secured contracts that competitors struggled to obtain. As the company's financial success became evident, so too did its symbolic significance. Goodyear emerged as more than a manufacturer. It became a representation of industrial confidence. Its name carried weight, signaling stability to investors, dependability to partners, and authority within the city. For Cyberling, this transformation validated a philosophy forged through earlier failure. Control, once elusive, now appeared attainable. But it also revealed a deeper challenge. Corporate power, no matter how expansive, remained intangible. Factories could be sold, companies restructured, leadership replaced. The permanence Cyberling sought could not be guaranteed by balance sheets alone. The act of building Goodyear thus extended beyond business metrics. It redefined Cyberling's understanding of legacy. He had constructed an empire rooted in production and coordination, yet he remained aware of its fragility. Markets could shift. Technologies could obsolete existing systems. The authority he commanded was real, but conditional. This awareness did not weaken his ambition. It refined it. The question was no longer how to dominate an industry, but how to translate industrial success into enduring presence. By the time Goodyear secured its position as a dominant force in the rubber industry, the company had already fulfilled its initial purpose. It generated wealth, influence, and control at a scale few could challenge. But it also exposed the limitations of industrial power. What Cyberling had built was immense, yet impermanent by nature. The next phase of his ambition would not focus on factories or contracts, but on symbols, structures capable of projecting continuity in a world defined by constant change. Goodyear was the foundation. What followed would be the attempt to turn industry into dynasty. Chapter 4. Wealth Without Tradition. Wealth arrived quickly for Frank A. Cyberling, but legitimacy did not arrive with it. By the early 20th century, his financial position was undeniable. Goodyear had grown from a fragile enterprise into a central pillar of Akron's economy, and Cyberling stood among the most powerful industrial figures in the region. Yet power in America was still measured by more than balance sheets. Beneath the surface of industrial success lay an unspoken hierarchy, one shaped by lineage, custom, and the quiet authority of families, whose names had carried weight long before factories ever did. Cyberling had money, but he did not have tradition. And in that absence, a deeper insecurity took root. Unlike old banking families in New York or land-owning elites along the eastern seaboard, Cyberling's authority was visibly new. It was tied to smokestacks, payrolls, and production figures, elements that could rise or fall with markets and technology. His wealth depended on constant motion. It required expansion, adaptation, and vigilance. In contrast, traditional elites derived status from continuity. Their power appeared effortless because it was inherited, reinforced by generations of social recognition rather than daily performance. This distinction mattered. In elite circles, industrialists were often respected, but rarely revered. Cyberling was acutely aware of this divide. He operated in boardrooms and factories, not salons and ancestral estates. His peers were engineers, managers, and financiers, not titled families or legacy institutions. Even as industrial leaders reshaped the nation's economy, they remained outsiders to the older structures of prestige. Their wealth challenged the social order, but did not immediately replace it. Acceptance came slowly, if at all. For men like Cyberling, success created visibility, and visibility invited judgment. The tension between wealth and tradition manifested in subtle ways. Invitations, affiliations, and social rituals carried unspoken signals about belonging. Old money did not need to announce itself. It simply existed. New wealth, by contrast, was expected to prove its refinement. Industrial leaders were scrutinized for their manners, their tastes, and their ability to conform to standards they had not created. This scrutiny reinforced the sense that economic power alone was insufficient. To endure, it had to be translated into cultural authority. In Akron, this divide was especially pronounced. The city was young, practical, and shaped by labor rather than legacy. Its leaders wielded immense economic influence, but the city itself lacked the historical depth associated with older centers of power. Akron produced wealth, but not aristocracy. For Seiberling, this environment offered opportunity without reassurance. He could dominate industry, yet remain aware that his position rested on conditions beyond his control. Markets could shift, public sentiment could turn, companies could be reorganized. Tradition, once established, was far harder to dismantle. This realization altered Seiberling's ambitions. The pursuit of profit evolved into the pursuit of permanence. He began to see that legacy required more than continued success. It required symbolism. Wealth needed an anchor, something tangible that could suggest continuity, even if circumstances changed. For centuries, land and architecture had served this purpose. Estates signaled stability. Grand homes implied roots. They suggested that power had not simply appeared, but belonged. Yet even this solution carried irony. By adopting the language of old wealth, industrialists implicitly acknowledged its authority. They sought to imitate the very structures that had once excluded them. For Seiberling, this was not an act of vanity, but of strategy. He understood that in America's social imagination, permanence was visual. It could be walked through, admired, and remembered. A corporation could dissolve. A building could endure. The absence of tradition also affected how Seiberling viewed family and succession. Old money dynasties relied on inherited roles and expectations. Authority was passed down alongside identity. For industrial families, this process was far less certain. Children did not automatically inherit competence or interest. Businesses demanded expertise, not birthright. This reality introduced a quiet fragility into new wealth. Without established customs to guide succession, continuity depended on personal discipline and circumstance rather than tradition. Wealth without tradition therefore existed in a state of tension, powerful yet exposed. It commanded resources but lacked historical insulation. It reshaped cities but struggled to shape memory. Seiberling stood at the center of this contradiction. His achievements placed him among the most influential figures of his time, yet his position felt provisional. The question he faced was not whether he had succeeded, but whether his success could outlast him. This chapter of his life was defined less by expansion than by reflection. Having built industrial authority, Seiberling confronted its limits. He recognized that dominance in production did not automatically confer permanence in history. To bridge that gap, wealth had to be framed, contextualized, and housed within symbols that suggested continuity rather than acceleration. The absence of tradition did not diminish his power, but it shaped his response to it. Before any architectural plans were drawn, before any estate took form, the idea had already settled in his mind. Industry alone could not secure legacy. To stand alongside history, new power had to learn how to look old. And it was within this realization, this quiet acknowledgement of what money could not buy, that the foundation for Stan Hywet Hall truly began to take shape. Chapter 5: Why Stan Hywet Hall was built. Stan Hywet Hall was not built out of comfort, nor out of excess alone. It was built as a response to instability, to insecurity, and to the quiet realization that industrial power, no matter how vast, was inherently temporary. By the second decade of the 20th century, Frank A. Seiberling had already achieved what many industrialists only aspired to. He had wealth, influence, and a company that shaped an entire city. Yet none of these guaranteed permanence. Factories could be sold, companies could be restructured, and markets could turn without warning. What Seiberling sought next was not expansion, but endurance. The decision to build Stan Hywet Hall emerged from this precise moment. It was an attempt to translate industrial success into something that could resist time. In an America still measuring legitimacy through lineage and tradition, Seiberling understood that power needed a physical anchor. Money moved quickly. Buildings did not. A mansion, unlike a corporation, could suggest continuity even when authority shifted behind the scenes. It could imply roots where none had existed before. Stan Hywet Hall was therefore conceived not merely as a residence, but as a declaration. Its scale, its design, and its location were deliberate choices meant to project stability. Situated away from the noise of factories and production lines, the estate created distance, both literal and symbolic, between industrial labor and industrial leadership. It marked a transition from the world of output and efficiency to a world of order, hierarchy, and control. Within its walls, industrial chaos was replaced by ritual. The architectural style itself spoke volumes. Tudor revival was not chosen for innovation, but for association. Its forms evoked English country houses, centuries old, tied to land, ancestry, and inherited authority. This was architecture designed to feel older than it was. In selecting this style, Seiberling aligned himself with a visual language of permanence, signaling that his wealth was not accidental or fleeting, but worthy of comparison to long-established elites. Stan Hywet Hall was built to look as though it had always belonged there. Yet the mansion's purpose extended beyond outward perception. Internally, it served as a mechanism of control. Its layout reinforced order, clear separations between family, guests, and staff, carefully defined spaces for work, leisure, and ceremony. This was not casual domesticity. It was structured living, mirroring the organizational discipline that had built Goodyear itself. The house reflected Seiberling's belief that authority functioned best when roles were defined and maintained. Stan Hywet Hall also functioned as a social instrument. It provided a setting where industrial leaders could host, negotiate, and align themselves with broader networks of influence. In these rooms, business relationships were reinforced through ceremony rather than contracts. The mansion allowed Seiberling to participate in a social world that factories alone could not grant access to. It was a stage on which legitimacy could be performed repeatedly until performance became perception. There was also a familial motive embedded in the estate's construction. Seiberling understood that corporations were impersonal, but households were enduring. By building a grand family seat, he attempted to root his success within domestic continuity. The mansion was meant to stabilize identity across generations, offering heirs not only wealth, but a setting that conveyed responsibility and expectation. It suggested that the family's place in history was fixed, not provisional. Importantly, Stan Hywet Hall was built at the height of confidence, not decline. This timing reveals its true purpose. It was not a retreat from failure, but a preemptive defense against it. Seiberling did not wait for his authority to weaken before attempting to preserve it. He recognized that the moment of greatest strength was the only moment when permanence could be convincingly asserted. The mansion was constructed while the empire still stood, lending credibility to its symbolism. At the same time, the estate embodied a contradiction inherent in industrial America. It was funded by efficiency, yet designed to suggest timelessness. It was powered by modern industry, yet cloaked in historical imagery. This tension was not accidental. It reflected Cyberling's understanding that modern power lacked the cultural depth of older systems. Hywet Hall was an effort to bridge that gap, to reconcile the speed of industry with the stillness of tradition. Ultimately, the mansion was built because industrial success demanded translation. Wealth alone could command markets, but it could not command memory. Hywet Hall was Cyberling's attempt to ensure that his authority would be remembered not just as profit, but as presence. It stood as a physical argument against impermanence, asserting that what had been built quickly could also endure. Before it became a museum, before it became a historical artifact, Hywet Hall was a statement of intent. It declared that this was not merely a man who had succeeded in business, but a family that intended to remain. Whether that intention would be fulfilled was a question history would answer later. But at the moment of its creation, the mansion represented the clearest expression of Cyberling's ambition, to turn industrial wealth into something that looked, felt, and claimed to be lasting power. Chapter 6: Inside the Walls of Power. Inside the walls of Hywet Hall, power was no longer measured in output or profit, but in order, routine, and controlled distance. The mansion was designed to remove its inhabitants from the volatility of the industrial world outside, replacing uncertainty with structure. Every corridor, room, and threshold reinforced hierarchy. This was not a home shaped by comfort alone, but an environment engineered to reflect authority. Within these walls, wealth was no longer active or aggressive. It was stabilized, curated, and ritualized. Daily life inside Hywet Hall followed a strict internal logic. Time was regulated, spaces were assigned, and roles were clearly defined. Family members occupied areas intended to signal refinement and continuity, while staff moved through parallel routes designed to remain invisible. Service corridors, staircases, and workrooms ensured that labor sustained the household without intruding upon it. This separation was deliberate. Power functioned best when its mechanisms were hidden. What appeared effortless to guests was supported by constant, unseen coordination. The household staff formed the backbone of this internal system. Cooks, housekeepers, groundskeepers, and attendants operated according to schedules that mirrored factory discipline, though their labor was softened by elegance rather than machinery. Expectations were precise, duties were repetitive, mistakes were quietly corrected. In this way, Hywet Hall replicated the industrial order that had built the Cyberling fortune, but translated it into domestic form. Control did not disappear at home. It simply adopted a quieter language. Social gatherings within the mansion were carefully staged. Dinners, receptions, and private meetings served functions beyond hospitality. They reinforced alliances, affirmed status, and displayed legitimacy. Guests were guided through spaces designed to impress without excess, rooms that suggested permanence rather than extravagance. The goal was not to overwhelm, but to normalize authority. By hosting within such surroundings, Cyberling placed himself within a visual tradition of power that predated industry, even as his wealth came entirely from it. Family life, too, was shaped by expectation. Children were raised within an environment that conveyed responsibility through scale and silence. The mansion did not encourage spontaneity, it encouraged awareness. Every room carried the weight of representation. To live within Hywet Hall was to be constantly reminded that one's actions reflected more than personal choice. They reflected a name, a position, and an inherited claim to importance that had to be upheld. Despite its grandeur, the mansion was not insulated from tension. The discipline that maintained order also limited intimacy. Emotional distance mirrored physical distance. Authority flowed downward, but rarely back up. This structure reinforced stability, but it also introduced rigidity. The house was efficient at preserving appearances. less so at adapting to change. Its internal logic assumed continuity, that those who held power would continue to do so. Hywet Hall also functioned as a psychological boundary. Crossing its gates marked a transition from public uncertainty to private command. Inside, the noise of industry faded, replaced by controlled quiet. This contrast was essential to its purpose. The mansion allowed Cyberling to step out of the constant negotiation of markets and labor disputes into a space where outcomes were predictable and roles unquestioned. It was here that authority felt complete, yet this completeness was fragile. The power contained within the walls depended entirely on conditions beyond them. The mansion could project stability, but it could not generate it. Its routines assumed that wealth would continue to flow, that influence would remain intact, and that the external world would respect the boundaries it established. Inside, power appeared settled. Outside, it remained contested. Over time, the walls of Hywet Hall began to serve a second function: preservation. They held memories, habits, and assumptions that no longer aligned perfectly with a changing industrial landscape. As markets evolved and corporate control shifted, the mansion maintained its internal order, even as the foundation of that order weakened. What had once been a center of authority gradually became a container of it. Inside the walls of power, nothing appeared to be wrong. Meals were served, rooms were maintained, traditions continued. This was the strength of the system and its weakness. By insulating authority from disruption, the mansion delayed recognition of change. Power, once dynamic, became static. The house preserved the image of control long after control itself had begun to erode. Hywet Hall did exactly what it was built to do. It transformed industrial success into the appearance of permanence. It created a world where hierarchy felt natural and authority seemed settled. But in doing so, it also revealed a truth that would become unavoidable with time. Walls can contain power, but they cannot protect it from history. Chapter 7: Cracks in the Rubber Empire. The cracks in the rubber empire did not appear suddenly, nor did they announce themselves with collapse. They emerged quietly, embedded within success, concealed by expansion, and often mistaken for temporary strain. At its height, the rubber industry projected confidence. Factories ran continuously. Demand remained high, and Akron still carried its title as the rubber capital of the world. Yet beneath this surface stability, the conditions that had once guaranteed dominance were beginning to shift. The very forces that built the empire were now introducing vulnerabilities it could no longer fully control. For Frank A. Cyberling, these early fractures were not immediately visible as threats. Growth had always carried tension. Markets fluctuated, labor demanded concessions, and competition intensified. These were familiar challenges of industrial leadership. But the post-World War I economy introduced a different kind of pressure. Expansion during wartime had distorted expectations, and when conditions normalized, margins tightened. Costs rose faster than revenues. Debt, once a tool for growth, became a burden that constrained flexibility. The system still functioned, but it required constant intervention to keep moving. Competition within the rubber industry accelerated. New firms adopted improved technologies, refined production methods, and entered the market with fewer legacy costs. The advantages Goodyear had once enjoyed, scale, early positioning, and dominance, were no longer exclusive. Market leadership demanded continuous reinvestment, and reinvestment demanded capital. Control began to shift subtly from founders to financiers, from visionaries to institutions that valued stability over ambition. This transition marked a turning point. Authority was no longer anchored solely in leadership, but increasingly in balance sheets. Labor relations further complicated this landscape. Akron's workforce had powered the rubber boom, but it was not passive. Long hours, repetitive tasks, and hazardous conditions bred unrest. strikes and negotiations became more frequent, challenging the assumption that discipline alone could sustain productivity. For industrial leaders, labor was both indispensable and unpredictable. Managing human systems proved more complex than managing machinery. Each disruption exposed how dependent the empire was on forces it could not fully command. At the same time, technological change began to undermine existing structures. Advances in materials science and manufacturing introduced efficiencies that favored adaptation over tradition. Plants designed for earlier production methods faced costly upgrades or obsolescence. Scale, once an advantage, became a liability when flexibility mattered more than volume. The rubber empire had been built to dominate a specific moment in industrial history. As that moment passed, its foundations required reinforcement. Financial strain intensified these pressures. Expansion financed through borrowing amplified risk when conditions tightened. As obligations accumulated, strategic options narrowed. Decisions once guided by vision were increasingly constrained by necessity. The empire could still produce, but it could not maneuver as freely. Power, once expansive, became defensive. Maintaining position replaced pursuing growth. This shift marked the beginning of decline, not in output, but in autonomy. For Cyberling, the most consequential fracture was the gradual loss of control. Ownership and influence became fragmented as financial restructuring altered governance. The company he had helped build evolved beyond his authority. Decisions moved away from individual judgment toward collective oversight. This was not a failure of competence, but a structural transformation inherent to large-scale industry. Empires outgrow their founders. In doing so, they redefine power. The contrast between the factory floor and Hywet Hall grew sharper during this period. Inside the mansion, routines persisted. Order was maintained. Authority appeared intact. Outside, the conditions sustaining that authority were changing. The estate remained a symbol of stability, even as the system it represented became increasingly fragile. This dissonance underscored a fundamental truth. Symbols endure longer than the realities they reflect. Public perception lagged behind internal reality. To the city, the rubber empire still seemed unassailable. Akron's identity remained tied to its factories, and confidence persisted through momentum alone. But internally, caution replaced certainty. Leaders spoke less of expansion and more of preservation. Risk aversion crept into strategy. The empire continued to function, but it no longer defined the future. It reacted to it. These cracks did not signify immediate collapse. They marked a transition from dominance to endurance, from control to negotiation. The rubber empire had reached a point where survival depended on adaptation rather than assertion. Yet adaptation required relinquishing aspects of authority that had once been central to its identity. For Cyberling, this represented the quiet unraveling of a vision built on control. The cracks in the rubber empire revealed the limits of industrial power. No matter how vast, it remained subject to economic cycles, technological change, and collective forces. What had been constructed through coordination and ambition could be weakened through the same mechanisms. The empire still stood, but its foundations were no longer unquestioned. And in that uncertainty, the meaning of Hywet Hall began to change, from a declaration of permanence into a reminder of what permanence could not prevent. Chapter 8. When the dynasty lost control. The moment the dynasty truly lost control did not arrive with spectacle, scandal, or sudden ruin. It unfolded slowly, through paperwork rather than protest, through meetings rather than headlines. By the time it became visible, the transfer of power had already been completed. For Frank A. Cyberling, this was the most consequential chapter of all, not because the empire collapsed, but because it endured without him at its center. As financial pressures tightened around Goodyear, the company's internal structure shifted to prioritize survival over vision. Banks, creditors, and institutional investors gained leverage, and with that leverage came authority. Decisions that had once flowed directly from Cyberling's judgment were now filtered through boards, committees, and financial safeguards. This was not a hostile takeover in the dramatic sense. It was a systemic realignment. Modern corporations were designed to outlast individuals, and Goodyear was becoming exactly that, a machine built to operate independently of its founder. Cyberling's loss of control was gradual but absolute. His influence diminished not because of incompetence or failure of character, but because the logic of scale demanded it. As the company grew larger, more complex, and more indebted, it required predictability. Personal leadership, once a strength, became a liability in the eyes of financiers. Risk had to be managed, expansion restrained, and authority diffused. The empire could no longer afford to reflect one man's ambition. This shift marked a defining distinction between industrial dynasties and traditional aristocracy. Old money families inherited land, titles, and unquestioned authority. Industrial families inherited none of that by default. Their power was conditional, dependent on performance, market confidence, and governance structures. Once those structures changed, lineage offered no protection. The Cyberling name carried history, but history alone did not grant control. For Frank Cyberling, the personal cost was profound. The company that had defined his public identity no longer required his leadership. He remained associated with its origins, but not its direction. His role transitioned from architect to observer, from authority to symbol. In practical terms, this meant exclusion from decisions that shaped the future of the enterprise he had helped create. In psychological terms, it represented a quiet displacement, being present, yet no longer essential. The loss of control extended beyond the factory gates. It altered the meaning of Hywet Hall itself. The mansion had been conceived as a physical manifestation of permanence, a statement that industrial success could anchor a dynasty as enduring as any European lineage. Yet now, its owner's authority over the empire that funded it was gone. The house remained unchanged, but its symbolism shifted. What had once represented command now reflected distance. Daily life inside the estate continued with discipline and order. Staff maintained routines. Social expectations were upheld. Visitors still perceived stability. But beneath that surface, the balance of power had already moved elsewhere. The mansion no longer stood at the center of decision-making. It became peripheral to the forces shaping the future of the rubber industry. This separation between appearance and reality defined the final phase of the dynasty's control. The city of Akron experienced this transition differently. To the public, Goodyear still existed, still employed thousands, still defined the city's identity. The loss of individual control did not register immediately. Corporations are adept at preserving continuity even as leadership changes. But within the upper levels of power, the transformation was unmistakable. Control had migrated from founder-led authority to institutional governance, from vision-driven leadership to risk-managed administration. This transition exposed a fundamental vulnerability of industrial empires. Their strength lies in systems, but those same systems eventually supersede their creators. The very mechanisms that enable growth, capital markets, corporate law, professional management, also dilute personal power. Dynasties built on industry are inherently temporary unless reinforced by structures beyond business alone. Cyberling's empire reached the limits of what industrial success could secure. For Frank Cyberling, losing control did not mean irrelevance, but it did mean finality. There would be no return to command, no restoration of authority. The empire had moved on, carrying his name, but not his will. This was not betrayal. It was evolution. Modern industry does not preserve loyalty, it preserves function. In this moment, the idea of dynasty itself began to unravel. The Cyberling legacy remained visible in architecture, philanthropy, and historical memory, but its operational power was gone. What endured was not control, but presence, not authority, but evidence. Stan Hywet Hall became less a seat of power and more a monument to a specific moment when one man believed industrial success could secure permanence. Chapter 9. A Mansion Without Power. By the time Stan Hywet Hall became a mansion without power, nothing about its appearance suggested loss. The stone walls remained immovable, the gardens disciplined, the interiors preserved with the same deliberate order that had once projected authority. Yet power had already withdrawn from the space, leaving behind only its architecture. What endured was form without function, presence without command, a residence still grand, but no longer central to any empire. The transformation was subtle. There was no formal declaration that Stan Hywet Hall no longer mattered. No event marked the moment when it ceased to influence decisions shaping industry or city. Instead, relevance faded as authority relocated elsewhere, into corporate offices, boardrooms, and financial institutions detached from personal estates. Power no longer required proximity to its symbols. It operated through systems that had no need for halls, portraits, or inherited space. For the Cyberling family, this marked a profound shift in daily reality. The mansion remained their home, but it was no longer an extension of industrial command. Conversations held within its rooms no longer shaped strategy or policy. Guests arrived not to negotiate power, but to acknowledge history. The estate transitioned from a place where outcomes were determined to a place where outcomes were remembered. This change revealed an uncomfortable truth about industrial wealth. Unlike feudal or aristocratic systems, where land and residence were inseparable from authority, modern power was mobile. It flowed toward efficiency, not symbolism. Once decision-making migrated into corporate governance structures, physical proximity lost relevance. Stan Hywet Hall had been built to anchor power in place. The modern economy unanchored it entirely. The staff continued their routines, maintaining standards established decades earlier. Order persisted, but its purpose had changed. Where discipline once supported authority, it now supported preservation. The house was no longer preparing for the future. It was maintaining the past. Each restored surface and preserved room reinforced the same reality. This was no longer a living center of power, but a controlled memory of it. Public perception lagged behind this internal shift. To many, Stan Hywet Hall still represented wealth and influence. Its scale alone implied importance. Visitors interpreted size as significance, permanence as relevance. But the relationship between space and power had already been severed. The mansion remained impressive precisely because it no longer needed to perform. Its role was aesthetic and historical, not functional. The absence of power became most evident in what no longer happened. No urgent decisions originated there. No strategic alliances were formed within its walls. No futures were negotiated across its tables. The house existed outside the flow of consequence. Events continued elsewhere, indifferent to its presence. This silence was not emptiness. It was displacement. For Frank Cyberling, this phase represented a final separation between identity and influence. He remained associated with Stan Hywet Hall, yet the estate could no longer extend his authority. The mansion reflected who he had been, not what he could still shape. In this way, the house became personal in a new sense, not as an instrument of control, but as a boundary marking where control had ended. The concept of dynasty unraveled further within this context. A dynasty requires continuity of power, not merely continuity of residence. Hywet Hall offered the latter without the former. Without control over industry or institutions, lineage became symbolic rather than operational. The estate could host memory, but not momentum. This distinction is what defines a mansion without power. It is not abandoned, nor diminished in beauty or scale. It is simply disconnected from consequence. Its walls no longer influence outcomes. Its presence does not alter direction. It exists as evidence rather than engine. Over time, this condition stabilized. The mansion found a new role, not as headquarters of ambition, but as artifact of it. Preservation replaced expansion. Interpretation replaced authority. The building's meaning shifted from assertion to reflection. It no longer claimed permanence, it demonstrated impermanence. Chapter 10. Legacy preserved, authority gone. By the time Hywet Hall entered its final phase, the distinction between legacy and authority had become unmistakable. One endured, the other was gone. What remained was not power in any functional sense, but preservation, carefully managed, deliberately framed, and consciously separated from influence. This chapter is not about collapse, but about resolution. The Cyberling dynasty did not end in disgrace or disappearance. It ended in definition. Legacy survived because it could be curated. Authority vanished because it could not. Authority depends on leverage, on decision-making power, on the ability to shape outcomes in real time. Once those mechanisms migrated into corporate structures and institutional systems, they could not be reclaimed through memory or architecture. Hywet Hall could preserve the story of power, but it could not restore the conditions that made power possible. The estate itself became the clearest expression of this transformation. Every preserved room, every maintained garden, every documented artifact reinforced a singular narrative. This place once mattered. The language of preservation replaced the language of command. Interpretation replaced instruction. The mansion no longer projected intent toward the future. It explained the past. In doing so, it achieved permanence of a different kind, static rather than dynamic. This shift reflects a broader truth about industrial dynasties in America. Unlike monarchies or landed aristocracies, industrial families operate within systems designed to outlast individuals. Corporate governance, financial regulation, and market forces ensure continuity at the expense of personal authority. Once those systems mature, founders become historical references rather than active agents. Their influence is acknowledged, but not consulted. For the Cyberling family, preservation became the final form of control available. They could no longer guide industry, but they could guide memory. By choosing what to maintain, what to display, and what to explain, they shaped how the dynasty would be understood. This is not a minor power. Memory determines reputation. Reputation determines interpretation. Yet it is fundamentally different from authority. It influences perception, not outcome. Hywet Hall's transition into a preserved estate formalized this reality. The mansion ceased to be private power and became public history. Its rooms were no longer exclusive spaces of decision-making, but curated environments designed for observation. This transition required intentional restraint. Preservation demands neutrality. It avoids judgment, ambition, and intervention. In exchange, it offers longevity. The cost of this exchange was finality. Once preserved, the mansion could no longer evolve with the family's ambitions. It became fixed in time, anchored to a specific era of success. This freezing of narrative ensured clarity, but it also closed the door on renewal. The dynasty could be remembered, but not reactivated. Authority, unlike legacy, resists preservation. It exists only in motion. It requires engagement with uncertainty, conflict, and risk. When cyberling authority ended, it did so conclusively. There was no mechanism for inheritance, no pathway for restoration. The systems that replaced individual leadership were indifferent to lineage. They recognized competence, capital, and compliance, not ancestry. This distinction explains why Hywet Hall feels intact, yet incomplete. It contains everything except consequence. Its beauty remains unquestioned. Its scale remains impressive. But nothing that happens within its walls alters the direction of industry, economy, or society. The mansion no longer participates in history, it documents it. Chapter 30 does not mourn this outcome, it clarifies it. The Cyberling dynasty achieved what many industrial families could not: endurance of memory without distortion. By allowing authority to end rather than attempting to simulate it, the legacy gained credibility. It became honest. Hywet Hall does not pretend to command the present. It stands as evidence of a moment when command was possible. In the end, legacy preserved and authority gone is not a failure. It is the natural conclusion of industrial power. Factories close or evolve. Corporations outgrow founders. Mansions remain. What they hold is not control, but context. Hywet Hall fulfills that role precisely. It does not dominate history. It allows history to be understood. This is the final truth of the old money dynasty it represents. Power built it. Time redefined it. Preservation completed it. And in that completion, the illusion of permanence gave way to something more enduring: clarity.